Hi everyone, my name is Julia. I'm a PhD student at the Center at Imperial, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I think using the patient voice in psychedelic trials has not only helped us, but I think is an important part of all subsequent trial designs. So first I'm going to define patient involvement. So the term I'll be using is PPI. It stands for public and patient involvement. And basically what that means is that the focus is shifting from doing research on people and instead doing it with people. So it's moving towards a space of equality and integration and kind of moving away from objectification of patients. So this can include anyone with lived experience. So for example, it can include patients themselves or their carers, or also lay people, community members, or PPI experts. And it informs all aspects of the research cycle. So it can be important whether it's part of conceptualizing a study or undertaking the research itself or disseminating it later on. There are a few reasons that I think it's important to do PPI. It produces efficient and cost-effective and relevant research outputs, and it creates these nuanced treatments, which I think prioritize accessibility and patient empowerment. And this attention to detail, I think, nurtures a trusting relationship, and particularly this is relevant in healthcare. And then the overall outcome is that patients tend to fare better, and they're more likely to actually comply with recommendations. And this is particularly interesting in chronic conditions like the ones that we've been discussing all day today, such as depression, but also what I'm going to be giving you an example on, which is chronic pain. There's many types of PPI, so the choice will largely depend on the specific intention or purpose for your trial, but general impressions can be obtained from patient groups online, for example, on Reddit, to more specific questions which might be asked in a workshop setting. And then the most direct method is implementing a research oversight panel. And if you're interacting closely with patients or public collaborators, they can help you with very specific actions. So for example, in my trial, which I'll be telling you about shortly, we have a research oversight panel of people with lived experience who co-produced all of our patient-facing documents, so the patient information sheets, to make sure that it's readable and useful for people. And they also can provide kind of practical feedback. So for example, things that you wouldn't think about yourself if you haven't had that lived experience. So we are putting our patients with chronic pain into an MRI scanner. I would have never thought that, you know, you'd have to put pillows around them to make that comfortable. So little things like that is also, or are also really important. So I'm going to give you an example of what PPI looks like in action. And the example is for my trial, Silopane. And this study investigates psilocybin in a chronic pain population, specifically in fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia produces widespread pain with serious impairments in function, but it also has significant mental health comorbidities, with about 60% of fibromyalgia patients also suffering from depression. The aim of our study is to learn about the central mechanisms of psilocybin therapy, so in the brain and psychologically. And we're going to be using a mix of neurophysiological data through EEG and fMRI. And we're also going to be including psychological, behavioral, and qualitative paradigms as well. But when we were thinking about actually designing this trial, we encountered some challenges because the background research of this specific subset of psychedelic research is incomplete, and there isn't a whole lot to go on. So I was thinking and thinking, but at the end, I thought it was important to not try to reinvent the wheel. So there's already a huge amount of information out there of people who have been self-medicating, people who have chronic pain who have been self-medicating with these substances, who have been posting their trip reports online and sharing this information. So I thought, why don't we harness this knowledge of people with lived experience, and perhaps this could help influence our trial. So we conducted a series of interviews or in-depth discussions with the aim to find out what is important for people who self-medicate in their outcomes. What do they find is actually helpful? And perhaps how could we use this information to improve our design and our protocol. We did 11 one-hour discussions with people who self-medicate with psychedelics, who have chronic pain. And the interviews were transcribed and thematically analyzed for major themes. And so here you can see some of the themes on the like little wheel picture. This isn't all of them, but it's kind of a condensed idea of them. There's a couple of very classic psychedelic themes here, like trusting and being open, and including tenets of mindfulness and breath work as important things that might facilitate a positive experience. But then I think there are also interesting, more pain-specific things that came up as well, such as including movements like yoga or qigong in the sessions themselves. So our general understanding of what psychedelic therapy looks like is that people tend to lie down, close their eyes, put on their headphones, and not move for 6 hours. And this is obviously not really going to work in a pain population because they'll be extremely uncomfortable. So that was really helpful. And then also finding ways to express physical and emotional manifestations of their pain through journaling or art. But one thing that I was particularly interested in was the fact that several participants highlighted the extreme physical intensity of their experience. And this is something that I hadn't encountered so much before. And this really kind of struck a chord with me. So I'll dive into that and show you how that influenced the trial a little bit. So here's a quote from the interview. Basically, one of our participants said, "I felt this intense welling of energy starting from the core of my body, and it started to overtake me. I started crying, breaking down, letting it all go, howling in agony. All of the suffering, I was just letting it all out. It was the biggest release of my life. I got to let go of so much grief, fear, and even some anger. I felt really healed. My entire body was tingling, and I felt so light. I felt so relaxed and completely pain-free." So this is a kind of an archetypal example of somatic release or somatic processing or somatic discharge. There are a couple of names for it. And this is this idea that is written about by several important people in the therapy field, such as Peter Levine, Gabor Mate, and Bessel van der Kolk. And basically the idea is that stress or trauma is stored in the body and can produce unease or dis-ease through a dysregulated nervous system, and that this can result in physical manifestations such as chronic pain. And releasing this stress or trauma can be violent and extremely cathartic. And this is, I think it's a really interesting concept, but it's still largely unexplored in rigorous research. So for example, there isn't one even name for it. There isn't a clear definition. And this frustrated me a little bit, but spurred my curiosity on even more, especially seeing as several of the participants found this to be really important in their experience. And so this quote raises questions of presence in the body, the mind-body connection, embodiment, and specifically also about somatic processing. And it inspired some new investigation or investigative directions for the trial. So we added some new measures to explore this question. So first we added the heart rate discrimination task, which is a behavioral task to look at interoception or how people inhabit their bodies. Basically, this task has two sort of trials. In the first trial, you compare an internal stimulus versus an external stimulus. So this is your heart rate or heartbeats versus tones. And you have to decide or report which is faster. And in the second trial, there are two external stimuli, two sounds, and you have to say which is faster. And then those are compared, and you can use that to basically see the amount of, or the fidelity with which you can interpret your own internal goings on, if you will. We're also looking at embodiment through some self-developed items that are used in some other trials as well. And we're also using a pain-specific Rebus model, which was mentioned a few times so far today. We're calling it the REBQP. I forgot to update it here. Anyway, this looks at people's beliefs and their relationship to their body and their pain, and hopefully we can see that changing throughout the trial. Finally, I also, with the help of my friends and colleagues, created the Somatic Processing Questionnaire, creatively titled, investigating somatic processing by hopefully trying to catalog physical symptoms that people report and whether there are any links to meaningful experiences, to emotions, and if that in turn causes any relief or release or catharsis. So we want to see, you know, does this phenomenon happen? If so, what happens? And can this contribute to some sort of a definition that, you know, we can use for future research? And then if we zoom out, we can also look at how PPI influenced our trial more broadly in terms of therapeutic protocol development. So it helped us directly identify topics to address and developed values and therapeutic priorities. So we focused on 4 major points. We don't have to zoom in on all of these. I'll zoom in on one later. But basically the 4 points are experiential avoidance, alliance and trust, embodiment and somatic process, and finally creating a lasting positive change. And all topics are approached with the spirit of participant empowerment and partnership. And these are really core aspects and values of our therapeutic relationship. So I'll zoom in on the first one. So you can see this is just an example, but this is the process we went through for all of them. So first we had to define our problem. We know that desperation leads people to avoid their physical and emotional experience and disconnect with themselves and their bodies. And this creates an unhealthy relationship with themselves and their pain, and also just their general relationship to their condition. So the PPI that we did directly inspired this. So you can see the quotes all around it. Specifically, people speak about, you know, finding acceptance of their situation, and that this really helped them realize that their pain was a little bit more manageable, and that they didn't have to perhaps suffer as much. And so this made us think about some insights. What is the opposite? You know, what do we want to achieve? What is the opposite of experiential avoidance? So we were thinking of openness and willingness, acceptance of their thoughts, feelings, emotions, and sensations. We were thinking about the need for willingness and self-motivation as an essential part of achieving meaningful change. We were thinking that we already know from previous trials that avoidance is reduced following psilocybin exposure. And this all culminated in us deciding on one of our primary outcome measures. We have 2, but this is one of them, which is the Brief Experiential Avoidance Questionnaire. So this is a major aspect of our trial now. And then this therapy generated a therapeutic intention, because we want to move, or we want to help people move towards acceptance and openness of the full experience, not just the happy parts, but all of it. And it's obviously extremely relevant in pain, and especially prioritizes intrinsic motivation. So just a quick summary. I hope you can see how including the patient voice allows us to ensure that our research stays relevant and accessible to the end users. Embedding patient perspectives empowers people and strengthens the trust in the system and improves the efficacy of the interventions that we're trying to develop here. PPI can adapt to serve various research contexts and environments, and it can be as large or as small as you would like or need it to be. PPI has informed Psylopane throughout and has strongly influenced our therapeutic protocols and even inspired a new research direction. Beyond this, we've gotten useful input on nuanced aspects, practical aspects such as how do we deal with the MRI. So hopefully you can see that PPI is a really important, and I would argue essential aspect to include in the design of future trials, and how we can prioritize such engagement, and this will contribute to a more equal and representative psychedelic future. Thank you. Oh, one thing, we're recruiting. If you know anyone who has fibromyalgia, please come my way.
Okay, our final talk of the day is Ibogaine and Reciprocity by Kirran Ahmad.
It's just going through with the... Okay. Hi, everyone. Everyone's still in the room, last 15 minutes of the day. Okay, woo! Okay, so I'll give you a little bit about me. So my name's Kirran Ahmad. I'm an NHS doctor by background. I'm specialising in anaesthesia. So some of the talks earlier mentioning propofol, which I use in my day job, and ketamine, which I use as my day job here and in Africa, because I do some work with Médecins Sans Frontières as well. But I joined Imperial about a year ago now, working on a number of different projects. So I'm working on the psilocybin and chronic pain trial with Julia, and a ketamine trial in healthy volunteers looking at PET imaging. But during my time at Imperial, I found myself moving towards the ethical aspect of psychedelics. So last year, I joined Drug Science's ethics working group, where we're focusing on this concept of reciprocity. So reciprocity means the exchanging of things for mutual benefit. And I'm looking at that in relation to Ibogaine. So for the purpose of the talk, I'll be explaining what Ibogaine and Iboga are, an overview of the Western perspective, just with an outline of what's happened in history to current date, the impact that this has had on the Indigenous perspective, what the Nagoya Protocol is, which is a legal framework that exists around reciprocity, and Blessings of the Forest, which is a community interest company that I recently joined for Ibogaine and Iboga advocacy work. So the map that you can see highlights Gabon, which is a country in West Central Africa. And this has been the main source of Ibogaine for the last 100 years for the West. So what is Iboga and Ibogaine? Because, you know, sometimes they use interchangeably. So this is a picture of the Tabernacle Iboga shrub. This mainly is found in the rainforests of Gabon in Africa. And it's quite distinctive. It's about normally 1.5 meters in height, can grow to a 5-meter tree, has these distinct fruits on them that animals in the forest eat, and then they propagate the seeds, allowing the trees to regrow. Now, if you focus on the root of the Iboga shrub, that is where Ibogaine is isolated from. So there are a number of alkaloids within the root, around about 13, 14. And Ibogaine is a principal alkaloid. So that can be extracted in a number of ways. It can be a total alkaloid extraction where everything's taken. It can be isolated as Ibogaine hydrochloride, which is the most common way that we use it in the West. Or it can be used as Iboga, the shrub, so the actual root itself, either eaten directly, this is how the indigenous people of Gabon use it, or as shavings or ground into powder or in decoctions in teas and so forth. So this is just a picture of some of the indigenous people in Gabon, and they use Iboga in their traditions. It's been a center part of their traditions for thousands of years. We think close to 100,000 years. The Pygmy tribe, which are one of the oldest heritages in the world, who still live in the forest, say that it's been with them since the beginning of time. And it's used in their religion, the main religion in Gabon, of Bwiti, and it's used as a sacrament and also in initiations. But safe to say, it's very central to their entire way of life in Gabon, Iboga. So this is just an overview of what's been happening in the West. So in 1819 was the first Western reference of Iboga, where a British explorer noted in his documentation the natives eating a plant and taking long walks at night because they were able to stay awake for a long time. Then in the 1900s, Ibogaine was isolated from the actual root, and it started to be developed in France, and it was used as a muscle stimulant, so treated for influenza and sleeping sickness. And then in the 30s, it was marketed as lambarine. And then it was the 60s where the anti-addictive properties were first noted by an American scientist. So it's the addiction properties that is what the West are focusing on currently. And it was an American scientist, Lotsof, who basically, he was a long-term heroin user himself. And he ingested some Ibogaine and noted a decrease in his cravings and a lack of withdrawal symptoms. So he then went on to patent it in the 80s. And then in the early 90s, there was FDA approval for the first study in humans, but it got stopped after the first patient because of various issues with patent disagreements and concerns around safety, etc. But at that time, the anti-addictive properties had been noted. And so there were, even though it's a Schedule I drug in the UK and the US, a number of legal clinics exist around the world. So in places like Mexico, Brazil, Thailand. And there was a lot of underground work being done with Ibogaine for substance use disorder, so mainly with opiates. And most recently, in 2021, a phase 1/2A trial has begun in Manchester by Deborah Mash and her team, looking at opioid use disorder. Now, the exact mechanism of Ibogaine, we know it works on multiple transmitter systems. Preclinical studies have shown that Ibogaine, which is one of the main metabolites of Ibogaine, works at the kappa opioid receptor, thereby blocking the endogenous dynorphin, reducing that, which is one of the things that contribute to withdrawal symptoms. So that's about as much I'm going to mention on that perspective, because I want to go into the indigenous perspective now. So 85%. That is the number of trees, the percentage of trees, iboga trees, that have disappeared from the rainforest in the last 50 years. Just take a sip of water. And we know that that is mainly due to the international demand in the West. So what that means is it's driven up iboga poaching in this region, because then they can sell this on the black market for up to 4,000 times the market value. The commonest route for this is Cameroon, which actually borders the north of Gabon. So traffickers come into Gabon and go to the heart of the forests and national parks, and they plunder the resources. Normally, the traditional people, if they want to use iboga, they would simply go into the nearby rainforest and they would just remove roots from the tree in a sustainable manner and let the tree grow. But that's not what the traffickers do. They plunder the resources. And then they sell it to the highest bidders on social networks. And we think, and again, we've worked with NGOs in Africa who monitor like trafficking arrests, that we estimate that up to 90% of Ibogaine in the West has come from a poached source. But it doesn't necessarily, it's not posed as that, it's posed as ethically sourced through various routes. And these figures, by the way, are taken from the Ministry of Forest and Waters from Gabon. Okay, so sadly, with iboga poaching comes elephant poaching, or elephant killing for the ivory. This is because elephants eat the fruits on iboga trees. So what the traffickers do is that they follow the roots, the track marks of the elephants to find the iboga resource, plunder the resources, and then they kill the elephant for the ivory as well. So we're seeing a massive reduction in the elephants in this region, having a huge consequence on the natural ecosystems in the rainforest. So as a result of this, in 2011, the First Lady of Gabon, she recognized what was going on. There was a huge, not an outcrop, in the public domain, noticing that the deforestation, the effects that this was having on the indigenous people. So she commissioned the writing of a report to understand what was going on in the scientific world in the West and how they were using Ibogaine, because this wasn't really being fed back to Gabon. So this report was led by this gentleman, so Jan Guinon. So he's one of the leading names in Iboga sustainability. He's been working with the indigenous people in Gabon since 2006 and the authorities. He's an international sustainability consultant, and he was given a mandate by the Gabonese Ministry of Culture to defend the rights of the people. He was supported by Professor Gasita. He is an 85-year-old pharmacist, psychopharmacologist, and a world authority on Iboga. He has said for decades the importance of using traditional medicines to look after them as a way of working themselves out of poverty, and the issues of sustainability around the Iboga resource, noticing that it was becoming diminished. So the report that was written was shared with the authorities in Gabon, who were absolutely shocked with the lack of supervision of the sector and what was going on. And as a result of that, the Nagoya Protocol came into action. So the Nagoya Protocol is from the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And it's an international framework, a legal framework that exists, which is about access and benefit sharing of genetic resources that arise from a country, and any profit that's made that's shared in a fair way. So Gabon has been the first country in the world to sign up to the Nagoya Protocol with a psychoactive substance, that being Iboga. So what that means is, if Iboga, it leaves the country and is being profited by someone internationally as Ibogaine, then they have to give back or benefit share with the people, with the indigenous people. Now, step one is signing the protocol, and then step two is actually getting it implemented. And that's what's happening at the moment. We're waiting for the Gabonese government to implement the protocol, but these things take time, they take money, you need legal framework, you need Nagoya teams, but that's all starting to happen now. In response to the Nagoya Protocol being signed, it was recognized that projects and things that were happening in Gabon needed to be aligned to the Nagoya Protocol, so i.e. ethically sourced Iboga, not trafficked Iboga, and sharing of benefits. So in response, Blessings of the Forest was created. So this is a community interest company. It's not for profit, and they have an NGO sector in Gabon. And basically, they act as intermediaries. They have several roles. They act as intermediaries between the indigenous people of Gabon and the international communities. And between the founders, so Professor Gasita and Jan, they have over 50 years of experience really understanding what's happening on the ground with the indigenous people. So one of the main projects that they're focusing on is creating community Iboga farms. So encouraging villagers to plant new Iboga shrubs so that they could be grown in an ethical way, and then supply chains can be created for it to be sold to international markets. And in between, it needs to be converted to Ibogaine. And again, all of that requires infrastructure and frameworks to be set up, which is what Blessings of the Forest are helping with. And like I said, they act as intermediaries. So from Gabon is a French-speaking country, And to engage with international communities, again, it requires connection, it requires a bridge between them. And reciprocity. So I recently joined them in Blessed the Forest a few months ago as the medical reciprocity manager. And my role there is to engage with international communities who are either developing Ibogaine or who are working with Ibogaine to encourage them to give a percentage of their profits back to the indigenous people so that they can then, Blessings of the Forest, can then support them to build these community iboga farms. The villagers can then directly sell their iboga as Ibogaine eventually to the international communities. Then those villagers can generate their own income and then become self-sustained. That's the idea. So, as it was International Women's Week, Women's Day this week, I've put up, this is Mama Mazembe. She is a respected elder in the Gabonese community as in one of the ethnicities. And she obviously supports Blessings of the Forest. She's wearing a t-shirt. But there are 53 different ethnicities that exist in Gabon. And Blessings of the Forest have support from over 30 of those 53 ethnicities through their leaders. They're known as Negangas, the equivalent of a shaman. And that number is growing. But it obviously takes time to build the connection and relationships and trust with the local people in order for Blessings of the Forest to support the communities. And this is just an example of some of the iboga farms. They're planted right next to the rainforest. And on the left is young iboga bushes growing. And on the right are some that are ready to harvest. So just to know, it takes 5 to 7 years for an iboga shrub to grow so that the roots can be harvested for Ibogaine. So again, Blessings of the Forest play a supporting role at the moment until those trees can grow and be sold to the international communities. And that's what we're helping with. So I'd just like to finish by saying, yes, Ibogaine is being developed and there's really promising results for addiction. But at the same time, for us to remember the Indigenous perspective and to hold gratitude for the Indigenous people who have actually stewarded and looked after this medicine and the knowledge for thousands of years. So now that it can be shared with the West for these treatments. And now it's our turn in the West to be able to support these people, the Indigenous people, to use their own medicine as a way of working themselves out of poverty. And that is what reciprocity is. Thank you. I was just going to say there's no time for questions, but if you want to contact me for anything, my email is up there, so you can feel free to get in touch.